The following was taken from my DEF CON 23 talk at the Paris Hotel in Las Vegas, Nevada. It was recorded on August 7th, 2015.
The creative misapplication of technology.
So Dianne Feinstein comes up and says, this was a very hastily called meeting from the Intelligence Committee. And she goes, as you know, this is just metadata. There's no content involved. Okay, so as a citizen of the United States, this made me feel pretty damn good, all right? It's just, okay, so you know I went to the library, but you don't know what I looked at? Oh, that's okay. That's okay. That's pretty good. So then our own president got involved. Says, nobody's listening to your phone calls. That's not what this program's about. Well, they're not looking at names and they're not looking at content, but sifting through this so-called metadata. Okay, they're sifting through the data, okay? And I'm thinking, I'm pretty familiar with data. I'm not familiar with a sift command and, you know? So this was good. This was very good. This was very good because now I know more about metadata. You can sift it, okay? So I'm starting to feel pretty good about metadata. But I really got confused then when Michael Hayden, who's the former NSA boss, chimed in, and he said, oh, we kill people based on metadata. So, okay, I need to know a little more now. I need to know just a little more. Okay, so metadata. Metadata is so important, and it's largely misunderstood. And we probably all know that metadata is data that describes other data, right? But more importantly than that, it's data that provides context for information. And usually the very best metadata doesn't even really exist. It needs to be created, all right? And that's where the fun is. That's where the data hacking happens. So if you study metadata, you know, academically in college, they've got this whole plethora of kind of categories for metadata. I like to keep it simple and say there's two kinds, basically. There's parametric data, and that's data that has to be collected or created. And then there's embedded data, and this is probably where most people got familiar with metadata initially, like in the 90s. And that's generally user-created. It tends to be kind of stuff like the embedded headers in a digital photograph that describes the camera that was used, when the picture was taken, the f-stops, geocodes. In fact, this stuff has become like a whole branch of law now because this is all submissible in courts. So I've got a couple of examples of these and some of the data that's leaked this way. This is one I actually used last year if you're at my talk, and I'm using it again because I just love it. This is a selfie of a Russian soldier that was uploaded to Instagram. And unfortunately, before he uploaded it, he didn't remove the geocodes. So it revealed the fact that while his government said they had no troops in Ukraine, he was in Ukraine. Another example, another war-related example, this is kind of a famous one. This is the Tony Blair memo. This was the memo that was the justification for the invasion of Iraq after 9/11. And it was actually used by Colin Powell when he went to the United Nations to make his justification. And the assumption was that this was done by area specialists, and it was all original work, well-researched. What we find out, it was actually plagiarized. And not just plagiarized, but it was plagiarized by a graduate student someplace in the UK. Oh, that was the original document, was a graduate student's paper. And they know it was plagiarized because not only was the content the same, but so were the grammatical errors. So where this gets interesting, though, is in the metadata. You know, Microsoft Office files are full of metadata. And some of it is for version control and all kinds of stuff. But if you look at the metadata here, we can see that the people who did the plagiarizing, we can figure out who they were. And we can see that they were not area specialists, but they were actually political advisors to Tony Blair. So it's kind kind of a nasty thing. This kind of stuff happens a lot, though. The CEO of Google, Eric Schmidt, a couple years ago, he wanted to put a PowerPoint presentation online that was just kind of a general status report for how things were happening at Google. What he neglected to do, though, is that when he made that report, he actually made a copy of a very confidential PowerPoint presentation that was for internal use only. And he did a lot of editing of the slides. What he neglected to do was edit the speaker notes. And within the speaker notes, he leaked the existence of a brand new project called Google Drive. And that was well before it ever was officially announced. So watch what you put in your speaker notes, because there's a lot of, it's out there. Okay, so let's talk, that was embedded metadata. Let's look a little bit about parametric metadata and see how that's used. So according to the NSA, this is their own admission, this is what they collect. They collect phone numbers of parties making phone calls. They collect the time a call was placed. They collect the duration of a phone call, and also who initiated the call, okay? Well, that's kind of invasive, right? But it's actually, they're not doing anything that any Android app isn't making available to the developer, right? I mean, stuff's in there. It's in all your phones if you have an Android. But with this metadata, you can get a lot of really interesting stuff. What they're really after is the relationships between callers, okay? Because the metadata creates the context within the phone calls, how they were placed, and within that, you can figure out the relationships of the callers. And these relationships can then be profiled, and once you've profiled them, you can pick out the anomalies and outliers. And at that point, it becomes possible to differentiate between a phone call being made by a parent at work to their child, making sure they got home from school okay. That phone call is going to look very different than some criminal operative calling in for instructions. It's going to look very different. And they're also able to identify things like burner phones, because those things are big outliers that kind of stick up when all this stuff gets profiled. The other thing is you can look at the patterns that people are calling and the relationships, and you can tie them to other events. And if other events affect the way people relate, there may be a connection between that and those events. So these are the kinds of things that the NSA looks for. These are the real red flags. And they'll go 3 hops. Okay, so what that means is if you have a phone call unknowingly with somebody who has had a phone call with somebody who is a person of interest, well, now suddenly you're kind of a person of interest too. So that's how that all works. So you could look at this and say, well, yeah, it makes sense that they would look at metadata because it's the easy way out. Otherwise they'd have to look at all these conversations, and they'd probably have to do some kind of speech-to-text conversion and deal with languages, and they'd have to deal with dialects and all that kind of stuff. But it's just better data. Just flat-out better data. It's already digital. It can be processed. But it needs to be created, okay? And that's the important thing about metadata. All these relationships and stuff need to be figured out. It's kind of like, how long do you need to play the game of Clue before you know it's Mrs. Peacock killing Colonel Mustard in the library with a candlestick, right? If you're good at this, you're going to figure it out long before the other people that are playing the game. So that's where the mind games come in with metadata. Okay, so how do we do metadata? How do we process things? Well, I'm not the NSA. I don't have unlimited resources and stuff. So the area where I live is called OPSEC, or Operational Security. And that is a military term. And what that refers to is looking at your day-to-day operations to see what kind of intelligence you're leaking. And if you had an adversary looking at your day-to-day operations, what kind of actionable intelligence could they collect? Okay, well, I do this online. The internet is my theater. So I look at things like employment postings. Last year I gave examples about how companies leak strategic plans through their employment postings. And I think you can kind of figure out how that could probably happen, right? If you think individuals leak information about themselves in social media, wait till you get a whole organization together leaking information on social media. It's a lot of information gets leaked this way. The way orders are fulfilled. So if you go online, place an order on a website, and if you watch the process, you see what kind of emails you get back, you look at order numbers, all this kind of stuff, you can learn a lot about the way a company fulfills items, where things are shipped from, all that kind of stuff. If they have a store, and if they maintain a store, you can learn all kinds of stuff about pricing strategies, the products they choose to stock, the products that they choose not to stock. Very rich source of intelligence. If you sell something to a company online, the way they buy things can be very revealing. In fact, you can tell a lot about an organization's financial health just by looking at the check numbers. Just little things like that. And then there's the whole regulatory area, and this is largely things that are done for transparency, financial filings, things that get filed with the courts, variants, licenses, all that kind of stuff. Together, this is where I get competitive intelligence from. This is where I live. And for my counterintelligence clients, this is what we protect, okay?
The creative misapplication of technology.